I have told this story maybe 100 times now, to my sister, to people at work, once to a man on a train who didn't even ask, but I could tell he needed something to think about, so I gave him this. And every single time the person listening stops me at the same place. They lean in, they go quiet, and they say, "Wait, he just stood there." Yes, he just stood there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the morning, because the morning matters. If you don't understand how ordinary it all was at the start, none of the rest will land the way it should. It was the first week of October, and I was in Hollencrest for 9 days. I'd saved for that trip for almost 2 years. Little jar on the kitchen counter, coins and the odd folded note, the whole embarrassing ritual of it. My friends thought I was mad for choosing Hollencrest of all places. Go somewhere warm, they said. Go somewhere with a beach. But I'd wanted to see the old capital since I was a girl, ever since my grandmother showed me a postcard of the palace gates with those guards standing outside in their tall dark coats. She'd never been either. She just liked the look of them. "Those are serious men," she used to say, tapping the postcard. "You don't get a face like that from nothing." So that's where I was, standing on the wide gray stone of Carrow Square, in front of the Hollencrest royal residence, on a cold, bright Tuesday with the wind coming off the river. Let me set it properly for you, because the place deserves it. The palace itself sits behind a long iron fence, black bars taller than 2 men, with gold tips that catch the light when the sun hits them. Beyond the fence there's a gravel forecourt, pale and raked clean, and then the building rises up gray and enormous, all those tall windows looking down at you like the place is half asleep but still watching. There are flags on the roof. There's a clock in the central tower that you can hear from the square if the traffic dies down. This deep, soft chime that always seemed to come a second later than you expected. And at the gates, at the 2 main gates and the smaller side posts, stand the guards. I want you to picture them because most people only ever see them in photographs, and a photograph flattens it. In person, they are bigger than you think. The coats are a deep charcoal, almost black, with a double row of brass buttons polished so bright you could check your teeth in them. High collars, tall caps, the kind that make a man look like he's been carved rather than dressed. White gloves. A long ceremonial rifle held at the side, but on the ground. The whole thing so still that if you didn't see them blink you'd swear they were statues. That morning there were 4 of them visible from where I stood, and one of them was him. I didn't know his name yet. I learned it later from a woman who worked in one of the cafes on the square and seemed to know everything about everyone. Sergeant Aldous Reyne, 22 years in the king's service. The kind of man, she said, the younger ones got assigned to so that some of the steadiness would rub off. But that morning he was just the tall one on the left, and I noticed him for a stupid, ordinary reason. He had a scar, a small one, pale, running along the edge of his jaw just under his ear. You only saw it when the light moved, and I remember thinking, that's a real person. That's a man who got that scar somewhere somehow and went home and had dinner and woke up and came here and stood at this gate. There was a life behind that face. My grandmother would have loved him. I want you to hold on to that thought. There was a life behind that face, because everyone in the square that morning forgot it. Everyone treated those men like furniture, like part of the architecture. And that, more than anything else, is what the whole story turns on. So the square. It was busy the way these places always are. Tourists in clusters, phones up, that little dance everyone does to get the photo without another stranger's head in it. A school group somewhere off to my right, 2 harried teachers counting children with their fingers in the air. An old man feeding pigeons even though there were 3 different signs asking him not to. A street performer further off doing something with juggling clubs that nobody was really watching. The smell of roasting chestnuts from a cart. Coffee. Cold air, river. And it was loud, but in that pleasant blurry way. 100 conversations overlapping, none of them yours. Somewhere a child crying and then suddenly not. The clatter of the gravel when a black car came through the side gate, slow, and everyone turned to look at it, and then turned away when the windows turned out to be tinted. I'd bought a coffee I didn't really want, just to hold something warm, and I'd found a spot near the railing where I could see the changing of the guard properly when it happened. That was the whole plan. Watch the ceremony, take a few photos, send one to my sister, sit somewhere and have lunch. A nothing day. A lovely nothing day. The first ripple came around 10:30. I felt it before I understood it. You know how a crowd has a sound and then the sound changes. It's not louder exactly. It's different. A pressure shift. Heads turning the same way. I looked where everyone was looking, toward the western edge of the square, where a short line of dark cars had pulled up along the curb. 3 of them, long, gleaming, the sort that cost more than my flat. Little flags on the bonnets that I didn't recognize, deep red with a gold bird of some kind. And out of the middle car, after a pause that was clearly meant to be noticed, came a woman. I'll be honest with you about my first impression, because it changed so completely by the end that I want you to have it for comparison. My first impression was, she's stunning. Genuinely. She was tall and slim, in a coat the color of old wine, with her hair done up in a way that must have taken someone an hour, and she moved like the ground had been swept ahead of her whole life. There was a man at her shoulder in a gray suit with an earpiece, and behind her 2 more in matching suits, and a younger woman half-running to keep up while holding what looked like a small folder and a phone and a pair of gloves all at once. Somebody near me whispered a name, Verrin, and then somebody else, the Duchess of Verrin, and the first person said no, and the second said yes, look, the bird, that's Verrin, and I gathered from the general buzz that this was a very important person from somewhere else. A duchess, visiting, foreign court, foreign title, but grand enough that people knew the crest on the car. I didn't think much of it. Important people come and go from palaces. That's what palaces are for. I assumed she'd sweep through the side gate in her wine-colored coat and disappear into the building, and that would be the last any of us saw of her. That is not what happened. What happened was that she came toward the gates, toward the public gates, toward us. And I think I've thought about this a lot. I think she did it on purpose. There was a perfectly good private entrance. The cars had stopped near it, but she came the long way round, along the front, past the railing where all of us tourists were standing with our coffees and our phones, and I remember the exact moment I realized she wanted to be seen doing it. There was a little smile. The kind that isn't really for anyone in particular. The kind that's for the idea of being watched. The man with the earpiece said something to her, low, and gestured back toward the side gate. She didn't even look at him. She just kept walking, slow and unbothered, her heels clicking on the stone, straight toward the main gate. Straight toward Sergeant Reyne. Now here's something you need to understand about that gate, because it's the whole hinge of it. The main gate is ceremonial and operational. It's where the guards stand for the photographs, yes. But it's also a real entry point with a real protocol, and there are things a guard at that post will do and things he absolutely will not do, and none of it is up to him. He doesn't make the rules. He carries them out. The rules come from above him, from people in offices I've never seen, and they exist precisely so that a man standing alone at a gate never has to invent a decision under pressure. He just follows the line. The line keeps everyone safe. The line keeps everyone equal. The Duchess of Verrin did not care about the line. She stopped about 2 feet in front of Sergeant Reyne, closer than anyone's supposed to stand, close enough that the people around me went a bit quiet, because we could all feel that something was off about the distance. You learn that early as a child, don't you? There's a normal amount of space between strangers, and when someone breaks it, your body knows before your brain does. He didn't move. Of course he didn't move. That's the whole point of them. But I was near enough, maybe 15 feet at an angle by the railing, that I could see his eyes, and his eyes moved, just slightly, down to her and then back to the middle distance the way they're trained to. He'd clocked her. He'd clocked the distance. He'd clocked the men in gray suits fanning out behind her. He just wasn't going to react to any of it because reacting was not his job. She said something to him. I couldn't hear it, not from where I was, not over the square. But I could see her face, the angle of it, the little tilt of the chin. And I could see that she expected an answer. There was a pause, that specific kind of pause where someone has asked a question and is waiting, and the longer it went on the more her expression started to change. He didn't answer. He couldn't. A guard at that post doesn't speak to the public unless there's a safety reason. She might as well have asked the railing. She tried again. I saw her lips move, slower this time, the way people do when they think the problem is that they haven't been understood. And I remember the young woman behind her, the assistant with the folder and the phone, stepping forward and saying something, probably trying to explain, probably mortified, and the Duchess lifting one hand a few inches without even turning around. A small gesture. Stop. Not now. The assistant froze. And the crowd, by now, had completely turned. Whatever anyone had come to the square to see, this was better. Phones came up. I'm ashamed to say mine was one of them. 40, 50 people, all watching this woman in the wine-colored coat standing too close to a guardsman who would not look at her. I still didn't know what she wanted. None of us did. We were just watching the shape of it, the demand, the silence, the demand again. It was like watching someone push against a wall and slowly start to realize the wall is not going to push back, and not being able to understand why, and getting angrier the more it doesn't. Then she raised her voice. Not a shout, not yet, but enough that the front rows of us caught it, and it traveled back through the crowd in fragments, person to person, the way these things do. Do you have any idea? That was the first piece I heard clearly. Do you have any idea? And you know, in my whole life, I have never heard a sentence that starts with those words go on to say anything kind. She gestured at the gate. She gestured at herself. The man with the earpiece took half a step forward and then stopped himself, and I understood from that single aborted movement that even her own people knew this was a bad idea, and that none of them were going to be the one to tell her. Sergeant Reyne stood there. I keep coming back to that because at the time it didn't seem like the dramatic part. The dramatic part seemed to be her, the coat, the voice, the rising heat of it. He was just the still figure she was shouting near. But that stillness was the story. I just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you what I learned afterward about what she'd actually asked for, because it matters, and because when you hear it you'll understand the rest. She wanted in, through the main gate, on foot, now, with her people, without going through the side entrance and the checks and the protocol like everyone else because, and this is the part that the cafe woman told me later and that I've never been able to shake, because in her view, the rules were for ordinary visitors, and she was not an ordinary visitor, and a guard who could not see that was a guard who needed to be made to understand the difference between her and the people taking photographs. She had decided, in other words, that the line did not apply to her, and she had decided that the man at the gate was going to be the one who agreed. He was not going to agree. But here's what I want to leave you with at the end of this first part, before the worst of it and the best of it happened. Because I've thought about it for a long time, and I think it's the heart of the whole thing. Everyone in that square, including me, looked at those two people and saw a powerful woman and a powerless man. She had the title. She had the cars. She had the suits and the crest and the voice that made strangers go quiet. He had a coat and a cap and a rifle he was never going to use and a rule he wasn't allowed to break. We had it exactly backwards. She had the kind of power that needs other people to keep agreeing it's real. Take away the cars, take away the title, take away everyone deciding to be impressed, and there's nothing underneath. It's a performance, and it only works if you've got an audience that plays along. His power was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need you to agree with it at all. He didn't need her to respect him. He didn't need the crowd. He didn't need anyone to clap. He had decided who he was a long time before that Tuesday, and a woman in a wine-colored coat shouting 2 feet from his face was not going to change it by so much as a flicker. We just couldn't see it yet. We were still watching the coat. The clock in the tower chimed the 3/4 hour, that deep note arriving a second late like it always did. The wind shifted and brought the smell of the chestnut cart over the crowd. Somewhere, a child asked his mother what was happening and she shushed him. And the Duchess of Verrin took one more step towards Sergeant Aldous Reyne, close enough now that the brim of her hat nearly touched the edge of his collar, and said the thing that turned a tense little scene into something none of us would ever forget. I'll tell you what she said in the next part, and I'll tell you what he did. Because he did do something in the end. It just wasn't anything she expected. I left you at the worst possible moment, I know. My sister calls it cruelty. She says I do it on purpose. Maybe I do. But it's also just how it happened. There was a held breath, a long one, and then the breath broke. So let me give it to you the way it came. The Duchess of Verrin leaned in, close enough that I genuinely thought for a second she was going to touch him. And she said, and I heard this one clearly, because by now the square had gone quiet in that strange way crowds do when they sense something is about to tip over. You will open this gate for me, or I will have you removed from it. That was the line. I will have you removed from it. And do you know, there was a part of me that flinched on his behalf, because she said it like she could. She said it the way you'd say, I'll have that returned to the shop, completely certain, no doubt in it anywhere. A woman who had never once in her life said, I'll have you removed and been wrong. And for half a second I believed her. I think most of us did. We looked at the coat and the cars and we thought, well, maybe she can. Maybe that's just how it works up there, in the world of titles and crests, where a word from the right mouth makes a man disappear. Sergeant Reyne did not move. I need you to understand how complete that stillness was. The wind was pulling at the hem of her coat. It was pulling at the gold cord on his cap. A leaf came across the gravel and bumped against his boot and sat there. And he did not move. Not his eyes this time. Not even the small flick downward he'd allowed himself earlier. He had gone somewhere behind his own face, somewhere she could not follow, and he was simply not going to come out. She waited. 3 seconds. 5. You'd be amazed how long 5 seconds is when 50 people are watching and not one of them is breathing. And then her composure cracked. Just a hairline, but I saw it. The smile she'd worn coming across the square that performed for the audience smile, it slipped, and underneath it was something I didn't expect. Not anger, not at first. Confusion. She honestly did not understand. That was the thing. You could see her mind working at it like a key that won't turn. She had done the thing that always works. She had pulled the lever that has opened every door her entire life. The title, the certainty, the threat delivered in a calm voice, and the door had not opened. And she could not compute it. It was as though gravity had stopped for her specifically and no one had warned her. Then the anger came. Because anger is what people reach for when the confusion gets unbearable. Look at me, she said, louder now, sharp. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. He looked at the middle distance, at a point above the heads of the crowd, off toward the river, the way he'd been trained to, the way he'd done 10,000 mornings. I am the Duchess of Verrin. She said it slowly, spacing the words, the way you'd explain something to a child. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand who you are speaking to? He wasn't speaking to her at all. That was the thing she couldn't grasp. He hadn't said a single word. The whole confrontation from her side was a monologue she'd mistaken for a conversation. The man with the earpiece tried again. He stepped up beside her and said something quiet and urgent, and this time I was close enough to catch the shape of it. Your Grace, the side entrance, they're expecting us, please, and she turned on him. I'd never seen anyone turn on another person quite like that. It was so fast. She rounded on him and said something I won't repeat, low and vicious, and the man, a grown man, broad, with the build of someone who'd done serious work in his life, actually stepped back from her like she'd raised a hand, and then she turned back to the gate as if he'd never existed. That was the moment I stopped finding her stunning. That was the exact moment. Because I realized the beauty had been a kind of trick, a surface, and what was actually underneath it was somebody who would humiliate her own people in front of strangers rather than admit she'd made a mistake. And still, Sergeant Reyne did not move. I want to talk about that stillness because I've come to think it was the most active thing in the whole square. We use the word passive wrong, I think. We think standing still is the easy thing and doing something is the hard thing. But anyone who's ever had to hold their tongue knows it's the other way round. It is so much harder to do nothing when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to react, to defend yourself, to say don't you dare, to match her, voice for voice. He had every reason to. She was insulting him in front of 50 people who were filming it. She was threatening his job. She was standing closer than anyone should stand to a man with a job to do, and she was daring him, practically begging him to lose his composure, because if he lost it, she won. If he so much as said step back, please, she would have had her conversation, her reaction, her proof that she could make a king's guardsman bend. She wanted him to crack. The whole performance was designed to crack him. He understood that. I'm certain he understood that. And so he gave her the one thing she could not use, could not bend, could not threaten. Nothing. Now I have to tell you about the boy, because the boy is when it turned. There was a family near the front of the crowd off to my left. Mum, Dad, 2 kids. The little one, a girl, maybe 3, in a yellow coat with a hood, had been getting restless the way small children do, and at some point in all this she'd let go of her mother's hand. Nobody noticed. Everyone was watching the Duchess. And the little girl, in the way of small children, had toddled toward the most interesting thing she could see, which was the gap by the gate, the strip of stone between the railing and the post where Sergeant Reyne stood. She wandered right into it, right into the space. Just a tiny thing in a yellow coat, looking up at this enormous man in his tall cap, completely unafraid, the way only very small children are. And here is the thing I will remember until I die. Sergeant Reyne, who had not moved for a woman threatening to end his career, who had not so much as blinked at "I will have you removed," who had stood like carved stone through every insult the Duchess of Verrin could find, moved. For the child, he didn't break his posture, not fully, but his eyes came down instantly the way a parent's do, and his free hand, the white-gloved one, the one not holding the rifle, lifted a few inches off his side, not grabbing, not even touching her, just opening just slightly into the space between the little girl and the gravel forecourt, the way you'd put your arm out near a child by the edge of a step. A small, instinctive, entirely human gesture. I've got you. You're all right. Stay there. The mother saw, gasped, lunged forward and scooped the little girl up, apologizing over and over, and Sergeant Reyne, as her hands closed around the child, gave the smallest nod. Barely a movement. Just enough to say it's fine, no harm done, she's safe. And then his hand went back to his side and his eyes went back to the middle distance and he was stone again. The whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. But everyone saw it. The whole front of the crowd saw it. And something shifted in the square all at once, this collective intake of breath, because in those 4 seconds the man we'd all been watching as a kind of statue, a prop in the Duchess's drama, had revealed exactly who he was. He wasn't cold. He wasn't unfeeling. He hadn't been ignoring the Duchess because he was empty inside. He'd been ignoring her because she didn't warrant a response, and the proof was right there, in the way he moved for a child who did. It told you everything about what he valued and what he didn't. A threat from a Duchess, nothing, stone. A small girl 1 step from a stumble, instant. And the Duchess of Verrin, and I will give her this, she wasn't stupid, saw it too. I watched her see it. I watched her watch this man she could not move himself freely, gently, for a 3-year-old in a yellow coat. And I think that's the moment she truly lost, though it took her a while to admit it. Because up until then she could tell herself he was a machine, a trained automaton, no more capable of acknowledging her than a turnstile. That was almost bearable. You can't be insulted by a turnstile. But he wasn't a machine. He was a man, a warm one, a man who'd put his hand out for a stranger's child without a second's thought. And that same man had decided, looking right at her, that she was not worth a single word. That's not a machine refusing you. That's a person refusing you, and it lands completely differently. Her face went through about 4 things in a row. I watched them. Confusion, then the anger again, then something that was almost embarrassment. And then, because some people simply cannot let the embarrassment win, she did the worst possible thing. She decided to make it bigger. "You think this is acceptable?" She turned to the crowd now, to us, arms slightly out, appealing to the audience she'd been performing for the whole time. "You see this? This is the insolence I'm talking about. This is what they let stand at these gates, a man who won't even." And that's when it happened, the thing that ended it. Not a shout, not a dramatic gesture, nothing she could have argued with. A voice, calm, low, from beyond the gate, from inside the forecourt, said one word. "Sergeant." I turned, and most of the crowd turned, and through the bars we could see a second figure crossing the gravel. Older, different uniform, more braid on it, the cut sharper, the bearing of someone the guards answered to. I learned later he was the duty officer, the senior man on the ground that morning, and the cafe woman told me his name, but I've forgotten it, which I'm sorry about because he deserves to be remembered too. He'd been watching. Of course he'd been watching. There are people whose entire job is to watch, quietly, from where you can't see them, precisely so that a man at a gate is never actually as alone as he looks. He came up to the gate on the inside, and he did not address the Duchess. Not at first. He spoke to Reyne, and his voice carried just enough. "You're relieved a moment, Sergeant. Hold." And then, and only then, he turned to the Duchess of Verrin, and he was perfectly, devastatingly polite. "Your Grace," he said, "I'm the duty officer. I understand there's been a request. I'll be glad to explain how access works here and why it works that way, and why it can't be otherwise for you, or for anyone, including those well above your station and mine. The sergeant hasn't answered you because the sergeant isn't permitted to. He's been doing his job correctly. Now, would you like the explanation, or would you prefer to make your visit through the entrance your hosts have prepared for you? I have never heard anyone get destroyed so gently in my life. Because look at what he did. He didn't shout her down. He didn't humiliate her, not openly. He just very calmly removed every single thing she'd been standing on. The rules apply to people above you. The sergeant did nothing wrong. You've been making a scene at the wrong man who was forbidden from defending himself while he stood there and took it. All of it, wrapped in your grace and a tone you couldn't possibly object to. And he made it a choice. That was the master stroke, the explanation or the proper entrance. He gave her a door out. He let her keep one shred of dignity on the condition that she use it right now and stop. The Duchess of Verrin stood there, and for the first time all morning she had nothing. No threat, because the threat had just been quietly dismantled. No audience on her side, because the crowd had turned the moment the little girl wandered up. No lever to pull. Because the one man who actually outranked the sergeant had just told her, with total courtesy, that she was wrong. I watched her gather what was left of herself. It took a second. Her chin came up. The smile came back, thinner, harder, but back, because that's what people like her do. They reach for the surface again when the inside fails them. And she said, in a voice she clearly meant to sound dismissive but which came out to all of us, sounding defeated, "This place has forgotten how to treat its betters." And the duty officer, God, I loved him for this, said simply, "Possibly, Your Grace. The side entrance is this way. They're expecting you." She held it one more second. Then she turned in a swirl of wine-colored wool and walked back the way she'd come, the man with the earpiece falling in behind her, the assistant scrambling with her folder, the whole grand procession now looking less like an arrival and more like a retreat. Because that's what it was. And Sergeant Aldous Reyne, relieved, allowed for one moment to be a man and not a post, did the most extraordinary thing. Nothing. He just resumed his stance, eyes to the middle distance, rifle at his side, the leaf still by his boot, as though none of it had happened. as though a woman had not just threatened to end his career and called him insolent in front of 50 strangers. He let it roll off him completely because, and this is the part I keep coming back to, it had never really touched him in the first place. You can't take from a man what he never staked. But I'm not finished. Because the best part of this story isn't the confrontation. It isn't even the duty officer. It's what happened after. It's what the crowd did. It's what the little girl in the yellow coat did 20 minutes later when her mother brought her back. And it's the one thing Sergeant Reyne said, the only words I ever heard him speak that entire day, which I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I'll tell you all of it in the last part. You'd think it would have ended when she walked away. A scene like that, you assume the air goes out of it the second the cause of it leaves. The villain exits, the crowd disperses, everyone goes back to their coffee and their photos, and by lunchtime it's just a story they'll tell at dinner. It didn't happen like that. And the reason it didn't is the part I most want you to hear, so stay with me, because we're nearly there. For a moment after the wine-colored coat disappeared around the corner toward the side entrance, nobody moved. 50-odd people, all standing very still, all looking at the same man. Sergeant Reyne, back at his post as if nothing had happened, eyes forward, the leaf still by his boot. And there was this silence. Not an empty one. A full one. The kind of silence a room gets when something important has just been said and everyone's letting it settle. And then someone clapped. I never found out who. Somewhere to my right behind me, a single pair of hands. And it was almost embarrassing for a second, that lone sound, the way the first clap always is. But it didn't stay alone. Another joined it. Then a whole cluster. And then the square, the whole front of that crowd, the tourists and the school group and the family and the old man with his pigeons, the whole square broke into applause. For a man who could not acknowledge it. I was clapping too. I didn't decide to. My hands just started, the way you cheer at something before your brain catches up, and I looked around and there were people with tears in their eyes. Grown adults, strangers. A man in a business coat next to me, clapping, shaking his head slowly like he couldn't believe what he'd seen. A teenager filming it who'd stopped narrating into her phone and was just watching now, properly watching. And the applause went on longer than applause usually does, because it wasn't really applause, was it? It was something else wearing applause's clothes. It was relief. It was 50 people who'd all, in their own way, met a Duchess of Verrin at some point in their lives, a boss, a customer, a relative, somebody who treated them like furniture and had to swallow it. And here, finally, was the version where the furniture won. Where the quiet dignity held, and the loud cruelty lost, and nobody had to compromise themselves to make it happen. We were clapping for ourselves a little, I think, for the version of every encounter where we'd kept our composure and it had been enough. And through all of it, Sergeant Reyne stood there, eyes forward, not a flicker. He took the applause the exact same way he'd taken the threats, by not taking it at all, by letting it pass over him, because acknowledging the cheers would have been just as much a break in his discipline as acknowledging the insults. He gave the crowd nothing, and somehow that made us love him more, because we understood now. We understood that the stillness wasn't coldness. It was the most disciplined warmth I've ever witnessed. A man holding himself to a standard so completely that he wouldn't bend it even to receive thanks. The applause faded the way these things do, in patches, and people started to drift, and I thought, well, that's the story. That's the whole of it. I'll have something to tell my sister. I was wrong. There was one more thing. About 20 minutes later, I'd stayed. I couldn't make myself leave. I'd found a spot on a low wall and was just watching him do his ordinary motionless job. The family came back. The mum and dad and the 2 children. The little girl in the yellow coat, the one who'd wandered into the gap, riding on her father's shoulders now, gripping 2 fistfuls of his hair. They came up toward the gate slowly, a bit shyly, and the mother caught the eye of the duty officer, who'd come back out into the forecourt to oversee something, and she said something to him through the bars. I couldn't hear it, but I saw him smile and nod and glance at Sergeant Reyne, and then say something back. and the mother lifted the little girl down off the father's shoulders. The duty officer murmured something to Reyne. A word of permission, I think. Because the rules, remember the rules he defended so completely against the Duchess, those same rules can bend for the right reasons, and a senior man is allowed to know the difference. That's the whole point of him being there. Not to enforce the line stupidly, but to know when the line is for safety, and when a man can step a half-inch outside it for something good. And Sergeant Reyne broke his stance. He didn't have to. Nobody made him. But he came down, he lowered himself slowly, all that height folding down, the tall cap dipping, the charcoal coat creasing at the knee until he was crouched at the level of a 3-year-old. Right there at his post in front of the whole square. And the little girl in the yellow coat walked up to him, completely unafraid, and held out her hand. And in her hand was a flower. I found out afterward where she'd got it. There's a stall on the far side of Caro Square that sells little posies to tourists, and her parents had taken her over and let her choose one, and she'd chosen, of course she had the brightest, most ridiculous yellow one in the bunch. To match her coat, I suppose, in the logic of small children, and she'd carried it back across the whole square in her fist, squashed half to death, to give to the big man who'd put his hand out for her. He took it. This enormous man in his uniform with 22 years behind that scarred jaw took a battered yellow flower from a toddler's fist with the kind of care you'd use for something made of glass, and he said something to her. Quietly. I was close enough this time, on my low wall, close enough to hear the only words I ever heard Sergeant Aldous Reyne speak. He said, "Thank you, miss, I'll keep it safe." That was it, "Thank you, miss, I'll keep it safe." And he tucked the flower carefully, properly into the top of his coat behind the brass where it sat, a stupid bright squashed yellow thing against all that dark formal cloth. And he stood back up to his full height, and he resumed his post, with the flower still there. And I lost it, honestly. I'm not ashamed to say it. I sat on that low wall and cried like a child, and I wasn't the only one. The mother was crying. The man in the business coat had come back and he was crying too, pretending he wasn't, doing that thing where you press the bridge of your nose. The whole little knot of us, strangers, undone by a flower. Because do you see what he'd done? Do you see the whole shape of it now? A duchess had come to that gate with everything. Title, wealth, beauty, power, and entourage, the absolute certainty that the world rearranged itself around her. She had demanded that this man bend to her. She had threatened him. She had insulted him in front of 50 people. And she had offered him nothing, nothing but the chance to be allowed to serve her, which she clearly thought was a gift in itself. And he had given her nothing back, correctly, completely. And then a child had come to that same gate with nothing at all. No title, no power, nothing the world counts. Just a squashed flower and an open hand and no idea who he was supposed to be. And she had offered him the one thing the Duchess never thought to. She'd offered him kindness, freely, expecting nothing. And he gave her everything. He came down to her level, he spoke, he kept the flower. That's the whole story right there in those two encounters back to back. That's what those 4 seconds and that one squashed flower taught 50 strangers in a cold square on a Tuesday in October. It isn't about rank. It never was. The Duchess thought respect was something you could demand, something owed to a title, something you could threaten a man into. And she walked away with nothing because that kind of respect doesn't exist. You cannot make someone respect you. You can only make them afraid, and fear isn't the same thing. And somewhere underneath she must have known it. Because you don't get that angry at a man who won't bow unless his refusal has shown you something true about yourself. The little girl never demanded anything, and she got the genuine article, the real thing, the warmth and the words and the careful hand, because the real thing is never given to the people who demand it. It's only ever given freely to the people who'd never think to ask. I stayed in Hollencrest another 6 days. I went back to Caro Square 3 more times before I flew home. I don't entirely know why. I think I just wanted to see him again, to check that he was real, that I hadn't built him up in my memory into something larger than a man. I saw him twice more, both times at the same gate, both times eyes forward, rifle at his side, stone still and watching the middle distance. And both times, and I checked, I made sure, I got close enough to be certain. Both times there was a small dried yellow flower tucked into the top of his coat, behind the brass buttons, where he'd promised a 3-year-old he would keep it safe. He'd meant it, of course he had. That was the whole of him, wasn't it? A man who didn't say much and meant every word of the little he said. My grandmother died 2 years before that trip. She never got to see the gates she kept on that postcard. But I bought a postcard of my own, from the stall on Caro Square, one with the guards on it in their tall dark caps, and I keep it on my own kitchen counter now, by the jar where I'm already saving up to go back. And sometimes, when I've had a day where someone with a loud voice and a high opinion of themselves has tried to make me feel small, I look at that postcard, and I think about a man who would not bend for a duchess and came all the way down for a child. And I think about how he stood there and let her shout and let us cheer and answered neither, because he already knew exactly who he was and didn't need a single one of us to tell him. Those are serious men, my grandmother used to say, tapping the postcard. You don't get a face like that from nothing. She was right about all of it. You don't get a face like that from nothing. You get it from 22 years of standing your ground when it's hard, and bending your knee only when it's right, and from knowing, all the way down, which is which.